John. John Aspler is the manager of the Canadian Persistent Identifier Community at CKRN. He graduated from McGill with a PhD in neuroscience, where his passion for public science literacy led him to work on projects on social media discourse about neurodevelopmental diagnosis. And in his role at CKRN, John combines his love of scholarship with a love of libraries by dedicating himself to community service and knowledge access. So with that, I will pass it over to you, John. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katie. So, yeah, I think maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I came to some sort of lunch and learn where I a little more casually, although this is still relatively casual, spoke about OJS. And a lot's happened in the last couple of years. So I'm very excited to be here again chatting with you all about the ORCID integration broadly in publishing workflows, but specifically thinking about how it works in open journal systems. And Katie's already introduced me, but I do want to flag that beyond supporting ORCID specifically at CRKN, we run a member-driven, institutional member-driven consortium for ORCID called ORCID Canada. We also run a member-driven consortium called DataCite Canada. And of course, University of Alberta is a member of the ORCID community in Canada. So I have three broad areas I want to speak to today. I do kind of want to get us all on the same page. I'm sure you all know what ORCID is, but I just want to frame what ORCID is just a little bit. I want to talk a little bit more technically then about how ORCID works, talking about typical workflows with ORCID in any kind of system, but then narrowing it down to the ideal publishing system workflow, and then ultimately focusing on ORCID for OJS with a bit of an emphasis on the Canadian context of that work. I'm also very happy to just take questions if you want to. I know it's being recorded right now and we'll have time to speak post recording, but if you just want to interrupt me or write something in the chat, I'm very comfortable with that as well. So what is ORCID? ORCID is both a global not-for-profit organization. It is the Persistent Identifier Registration Agency for ORCID IDs. There is no other organization in the world that is supporting ORCID in this kind of a central way, which is a bit different from some of the other PIDs. And ORCID IDs are the persistent identifier that ORCID provides. It is a PID for people. I'm sure you all know that there are PIDs for all kinds of things, including DOIs, digital object identifiers for publications and data sets. So ORCID is the PID for people. And ORCID, their organizational vision is a world where all who participate in research, scholarship, and innovation are uniquely identified and connected to their contributions across disciplines, borders, and time. You've probably heard me read this out before. So in short, what this ultimately means is that names are a bad way to identify you, and some sort of digital code is a significantly better way to identify you, especially one that is international, one that moves with you and isn't just locked inside your institution or locked inside your country. It is something that is, across disciplines, borders, and time, and name changes. ORCID ultimately frames three core services that it provides. The first is ORCID IDs to scholars. An institution cannot top-down assign an ORCID identifier. A journal editor cannot assign an ORCID identifier. It is something that an individual must create. And this service to scholars, it serves disambiguation. That is the core function. As I said that names are a bad way to identify people. I often tell this story, which is that my name is John Aspler. My father's name is Joseph Aspler. There is only a third, one of my cousins, Anne Aspler. There are only three of us who have ORCID IDs, and there are maybe two others who could want to get ORCID IDs. It's a very uncommon last name. And yet, even with two people with J. Aspler, it can sometimes be difficult for systems that are sort of just, scraping all of the possible works out there to tell us apart. And our ORCID IDs are part of what enables us to be disambiguated from each other. Besides the identifier, which is a 16-digit alphanumeric code, an ORCID record is attached to the ORCID ID, and that contains a bunch of scholarly activity. And I say that the core function here that it serves is connection. It's because your ORCID ID, which is a number, is pointing to a series of, let's say, DOIs, another series of numbers. Or it's pointing to all of your employment history, which might be a series of research organization registry identifiers, another set of numbers. And the idea is that it is connecting all of these things together meaningfully. And then finally, on the other end, this is more of an institutional use of ORCID rather than the individual use of ORCID. ORCID provides an API, an application programming interface that enables interoperation across any system that integrates with ORCID. APIs are very commonplace around the world. You're almost always using APIs when you're on Google or Facebook and an application asks you if you have permission to do certain connection pieces across them. That's usually using an API. The idea being that none of these systems are talking to each other, and or that rather none of these systems can talk to each other because they all speak different languages, and an API in another sort of third system like ORCID enables some shared communication. So in this case, it's the easy transfer of information about scholarship and the work that scholars are doing. And we'll talk a little bit about how, although the ORCID IDs themselves, they must be created by scholars, the API is typically used by institutions. The ORCID record is kind of where those two things meet. I can fill out my ORCID record manually as a scholar, or an institution or a publisher or a journal, an OJS journal, can add information to an ORCID record with that scholar's permission. And so this is the individual side of things. This is what an ORCID record looks like. This is not a real person. This is ORCID's example person. And then this is what it looks like, I think, when we're thinking about the aspirations and the big picture from the institutional side of things. We have the individual in the center who has an ORCID record. They've added some stuff. Maybe some information has been pushed into their ORCID record from some of these other stakeholders. An employer might add their faculty status, the fact that this is an employee at an institution. A funder might add a recently won bursary or grant, and a publisher would ideally be adding any successful publication and possibly even peer review information to an ORCID record. All of this is flowing in and out of the record, and also potentially across the other institutions in a variety of different ways. For example, a scholar who's applying for funding might find it easy or useful if that funder were to integrate with ORCID and then suck up all of their publication information from ORCID so they don't have to type it out every time they apply to something. In Canada, none of our funders are doing this yet, although we are moving forward. In Quebec, this is going to happen very, very soon. The Tri-Agency is looking at this, and we'll hopefully have more news on that front later. On the publication side, this is just a nice way to save everyone a little bit of time and also add a little bit of legitimacy to the information being added to the ORCID record. Because it won't just be me claiming I published this, it'll be the publisher saying, yes, John did publish this. So it saves time, research administrative burden, it reduces that, and it ultimately helps with this effective interconnectedness. And PIDs, ORCID IDs are really sort of the backbone of this kind of digital research infrastructure. So how does ORCID work? This is a very common workflow diagram, and I should say that every system interacts with ORCID radically differently. In an ideal scenario, this is sort of what you wind up seeing. You have an individual, this researcher. You've got ORCID's mantra, I suppose, underneath it, and enter once, reuse often. The idea being that they enter the information in ORCID, and then they can just shove it into any system they need to, rather than having to type it out manually every time in each system they engage with. So the researcher has information in their ORCID record, and then the first thing they do is they come up against a button that maybe says register or connect your ORCID ID, and they are asked to authenticate their identity and to grant permission to a system. And then from there, a variety of different things can happen. You can collect information from the ORCID record to help them fill out a funding application, to build a database, things like that. And you can add things to their ORCID record, like publication metadata. Some systems enable the scholar's information to be displayed, their ORCID ID to be displayed in some location, whether it's in the article metadata, in the published PDF, somewhere on a faculty webpage. And ideally, systems can automatically synchronize with ORCID. I'm not going to talk too much about that today because OJS does not have the synchronize feature, but it does do all of the other things. So to go through that a little bit more slowly, authentication is basically a process that enables an individual to identify themselves by logging into a third-party account. So when you are asked to confirm your identity by your bank when you're using PayPal, that is probably some kind of similar authentication process, because PayPal doesn't know your banking password, but you still have to enter it somewhere, and it's going through that process. And ORCID asks you to do that too. So if you click on a button like that, it'll bring you to the ORCID login page, and you'll be asked to say, this is really me, by logging in. You do this all the time, I'm sure, as well with your institutional credentials in different places. But it's not just about authentication, it's also about granting permission. So I can authenticate my identity with a system, but that system can't necessarily do different things to my ORCID record without my permission. And that's where the second step, an authorization step, comes in. This is where an individual grants permission to, let's say, a journal to be able to modify the ORCID record once that article is successfully published. So the article information is added to the ORCID record for them because they have both authenticated and authorized. As I mentioned, some systems enable you to display the ORCID ID. So these are just a couple examples. On the left-hand side, this is a colleague of mine. You can see that it doesn't actually have the full 16 digits, but if you were to click on that little green button, it would bring you right to her ORCID record. And then on the right-hand side, we do have a version of it printed out for someone. It's their faculty webpage. So different systems and different kinds of systems with different goals might have a different way or reason to display it. And so you can see just a couple here. Collect, as I mentioned, you might want to collect information to help people fill out forms or to create a database of some sort. Connect, this is adding information to ORCID. We've already talked a little bit about that. And and this is sort of what that ultimately looks like. This is affiliation information. This isn't publication information. I'll give you some examples of that in a bit. But here you can sort of see the difference between something that is asserted by a system that I've authorized to do this. My employment at CRKN clearly has a nice little green check mark, and it says that the source of the information is indeed CRKN. Whereas the teaching that I do at Université de Montréal is not adding that to my ORCID record for me, so the source of that is a little anonymous avatar, and it says John Aspler. So it's nice because it isn't just ensuring sort of the quality of the metadata itself. It really is granting that legitimacy to it, which is really nice to have when you want to say that I really did publish this in this journal. And like I said, I'm not going to go through synchronization, but if anyone wants to talk about webhooks and what this could look like in the future, I'm happy to answer questions. So let's talk about ideal publishing workflows. So we sort of come back to this diagram and we're focusing specifically on this connection and this relationship. So as I mentioned, any good integration has to start with an authentication step, but then the reasons and ways in which information might be collected and then pushed back out into an ORCID record might look a little bit different. So yeah, in an ideal publishing system, yes, the author will connect their authenticated ORCID ID typically at the submission stage, although there might be a few different ways you have to imagine this happening. And this is relevant for OJS as well. When I'm submitting something to OJS, I might be the first author or I might be a research assistant. Either way, there might be 7 authors on this paper, and each of those authors needs to be able to connect their ORCID ID. And it would be really inconvenient if each of them had to create an account for that specific journal and then log into that account and then find a way to add themselves to a specific publication. There's a different process for that. It's a very elegant workaround, which is basically just that the journal editor or the person who's submitting the article can click some buttons and an email is sent to an individual, and they just click on again, that sort of connect your ORCID ID button in the email, and then it sort of automatically happens. And then you have potentially all 7 co-authors very easily with just a few clicks able to have their ORCID ID connected to this particular publication. So yes, ideally you are having someone authenticate and authorize at a variety of different in a variety of places in a variety of ways. The first thing we might want is to collect information from ORCID to make manuscript submission easier. This isn't necessarily going to apply to the email workflow, but OJS does do this a little bit. If, for example, I am registering for an OJS account, I don't think this function is available right now, but it will be in the next update. When I'm registering, I can click a button that says connect my ORCID ID. I do this at the registration step, and then it's automatically pulling in my name and maybe my email address, maybe my country. It's not a huge amount of information, but it makes the registration process just a little bit easier. The ORCID ID is displayed on the work page with item metadata and on the author's profile page. So depending on how the publication platform or system works, you might have a system where all that matters is the public-facing article. Maybe there is a public-facing profile page for a given scholar, so it could apply there or it could appear there. Whatever it happens to look like, that given system, this would sort of be what we would want to see. And then finally, at the end of it, the article or the peer review information is then added back to a person's ORCID record on their behalf. I won't be talking much about peer review today, but I do want to mention that the peer review information isn't specific. You don't have to have an unblinded peer review process to do this. It will just say the journal. It won't say anything about what article was reviewed. It won't say anything about the time frame of that review. So it can still remain blinded. Although I guess it depends on how specific the field is and how likely someone is to know that this is probably the person who reviewed something. Either way, the idea is to give some credit to someone who's given their time for this process when the only people who know who has actually done this work voluntarily is the journal, and recognizing that can be complicated. So ORCID can be one way that you can recognize it through OJS. All right, and I'm doing okay for time here somehow. So now I will focus down on OJS specifically and a little bit of the Canadian context. I'm sure you all know that OJS is Open Journal Systems. It's a platform from the Public Knowledge Project, PKP, and they do have a couple of other programs or software systems. There's OMP, the Open Monograph Press, and OPS, Open Preprints System. OJS and OPS both share the ORCID integration that I'm describing today. So yeah, OJS is, of course, an open source software for journal publications. And I should say that it's actually the most widely used open source journal publishing platform in the world. I believe they have something like 44,000 or over 40,000 journals in use globally. Basically since 1998 or 2002, depending on where you imagine PKP's beginnings were. So yeah, it's been over 25 years basically, or about 25 years since this all started. In OJS, there are a bunch of different integrations, connections, plugins for a set of different PIDs, persistent identifiers. I'm talking about the ORCID one today, but it is useful to know that it is, of course, compatible with both DataCite and Crossref APIs. If you have a DOI that's being created when you publish articles in your journals, it's almost certainly Crossref, but there are some use cases for DataCite that are being used, and I won't go into that unless anyone wants to know what that means in more detail. And then same thing for the research organization registry. That is the research organization PID. There is a plugin for that. We strongly encourage that as well. It helps just sort of make the affiliation information a bit more consistent. This integration is being supported actively for any current version and the most recent previous version. So right now, if you're on OJS 3.3 or 3.4, this integration is actively supported for bugs. I believe that it only goes as far back as 3.2. Regardless, it's just that the 3.2 version is not being supported for bugs. So if there are issues, that is not something that can be fixed unless you want to go in and fix it yourself. And I do want to flag for journal editors and also for librarians here that we're about to move to OJS 3.5 next year. And what this means is that the plugin is going to be migrating into the core of OJS. So right now, and I'll talk a bit about this in a moment, to turn on the plugin, well, first of all, it's a plugin. You have to go to the plugin gallery. You have to know that the plugin gallery doesn't automatically update itself. You kind of have to keep going there every time you want to see if there's a new version of the software and update the plugin. So that's all going to be gone. It's going to be migrated into the core. The good news is that means that it is just going to be there and immediately usable by anyone easily. The bad news is that it does mean that bug fixes will be a little bit slower because we can only update it when the core software is updated rather than just whenever we want to update the plugin. But it is overall very, very good news. This is a map of the global usage of OJS from 2021. I think that this is showing only about 30 to 35,000 journals. So in the last just 3 years, it's gone up by another 10,000. And the reason I just wanted to very quickly highlight this is that the ORCID integration in OJS, which is developed and supported by PKP, really only works today in the way that it does, thanks to a lot of work done by folks around the world. We have a working group that we collaborate with the ORCID US community, as well as the folks at Cielo in Brazil, who are supporting the OPS version, or I should say are testing and using the OPS version of this plugin. And then ORCID and PKP sort of are working together in a really effective way to constantly address new challenges and issues that may arise over time. And it's a really active group. We meet easily 4 or 5 times a year, or possibly sometimes as needed. And I really do just want to highlight that although PKP is a Canadian organization and OJS is from Canada, it really is a global tool. And anything we do in Canada also benefits folks who are using this all around the world. And another thing I want to highlight is that this integration with ORCID is certified, and PKP is a certified service provider. That's not so important maybe at the journal editor level, but it is useful to know because there are all kinds of systems, including publishers that and publication platforms that are not certified providers. There are all kinds of publication platforms that have no ORCID integration or have weak ORCID integration. The OJS one is fully certified. What that means is that it meets a minimum set of criteria for a publisher to have sort of the best version of an integration. And so I do have, I won't go through this in detail, but I do have a little bit of a set of what criteria this meets. Yes, it is a certified service provider. Once someone has connected their ORCID ID, they can also potentially sign in to OJS using their ORCID ID through an authentication process, which is great. Information like the ORCID ID itself is collected once authenticated and displayed. Information like your name upon registration is read from ORCID, and then the works, the article, and peer review information can also be written back to ORCID. The only thing it doesn't really do is this syncing function, which I mentioned. What that does mean concretely for you is that if something changes, if you notice a typo in the title of the article, you've already published it, the information has already been pushed to ORCID. If you simply change the metadata in your journal, it's not going to automatically update an ORCID, which a syncing system would do. What you have to do is unpublish the article and republish the article so the ORCID integration can sort of re-up that information and push it in. There might be other ways to do it that I'm not aware of at the moment, but it is sort of it's not an automatic process, unfortunately. So anything you change on your side will not be reflected in ORCID unless you do the work to make that change too. So let's talk a bit about the ORCID OJS plugin itself. As I mentioned, it's a plugin. This is something that typically the library is managing, although I'm not 100% certain how you might be interacting with this part of it. But I'll just include this for now. As I mentioned, for now it's a plugin. It won't be soon. So what you do is you go and you click on the plugin gallery. You have to scroll down to find it. You have to click on the check box. You have to update it. You have to go and check it out to see if there is an update occasionally. It's a very manual process. OJS does not send you a notification to say, here's a new version of the plugin. That does have to be tracked on GitHub or in some other way. If you're not responsible for this part, then never mind. It is helpful to know that that's how it looks right now. The other thing to know is that this is how it is ultimately set up. Again, this is done centrally by the library for you, but it can be done at the journal level in different circumstances. Basically, the configuration involves you choosing the API. This one is the member sandbox. That's the testing environment. You're not using the member sandbox. You are using the member API. You will have a client ID, which is the username. You will have a client secret, which is the password. All of this has been blocked out on this slide. And some of the things that I think are helpful for you to know as an editor, or maybe the one thing, is that there is a little option here that says email settings. That is currently checked off in this screenshot to say send an email to request ORCID authorization from authors when an article is accepted, i.e. sent to copy editing. So if the person who is submitting the articles has not, through the submission process, clicked on buttons to send this off to authors, you can make this an automatic part of your journal management, which we do strongly recommend. It may already be set up. It may already be working like that through the library, but I do just want to flag this in case it's a place where you can start to do that. As I mentioned, there's an email that gets sent out. It looks like this. I've again whited out names and specifics and stuff. So dear so-and-so, you have been listed as an author on the manuscript submission. This submission to the Journal of Journals. Please allow us to add your ORCID ID to the submission. And it sort of describes what's happening. You can learn more about ORCID at the journal. There's usually a What is ORCID page that is tied to this integration on the journal itself. And otherwise, there's the Register Connect Your ORCID ID button. It's nice because if the person doesn't actually have an ORCID, it is inviting them to create one whole cloth. And if they do have one, then they can click that same button and make this all happen too. I should say that this particular slide is something I'm pulling from a presentation from York University, Tomasz Mrzewski, and this is his note, which is saying that this is more for the library than anything, but if there's ever a new journal and it has a new URI, that journal needs to be added to the list of redirect URIs that ORCID is including for this integration. So this is whether it's the library or whether it's the journal editor for a new journal, or if journals have changed location, please make this a part of your process to ensure that changing the location or creating a new journal, that it's not broken. It needs to be connected to ORCID by ORCID. And there's a little link there that'll be on the slides. It's just the regular register for ORCID button that any institution would be using. And I guess maybe just to very quickly clarify, I am talking, when I was talking about the email here, register, that's an individual registering for an ORCID ID. And when I'm talking about register over here, that's an institution registering for a set of API credentials to interact with the ORCID API and to interact as the University of Alberta. This is maybe the last thing. Again, this is coming from Tomasz's slides from York University, and it's just what it looks like to potentially add a user. If you are the submitting user or the author who's submitting, when you are adding a list of contributors, you can also be the person to send an email request for ORCID authorization. There are some little things here that look a little bit overly technical. Like I don't really know what it means to say delete ORCID ID and access token. That's sort of a slightly public-facing framing that might not necessarily make sense to every author. This is being updated, especially as we go into OJS 3.5. And I guess I'll just end by saying that I'm very lucky to, a few months after working really hard with these folks to sort of move this integration forward, totally independently of that, I wound up submitting an article to a journal hosted at Brock University. So I get to sort of use my own use case as an example here. This is what the landing page looks like for an article. So I mentioned the display of the ORCID ID. Well, you can see that the three authors, each of us has our ORCID ID there, and it also shows the DOI on the page. So we have these two PIDs listed right there, and each of our ORCID IDs will point to a set of DOIs, and this DOI will point back to this page, which includes our list of ORCID IDs. It's great. Everything is connecting together. And then this is what it looks like in my ORCID record. I can expand it to see a whole bunch more metadata, including maybe the abstract and stuff like that. But the important piece here is that it is a legitimate green check mark saying that this is from the Brock University Open Journal System. And U of A will have one that looks just like that. And where I'll end is just to say that we have a whole bunch of OJS systems being used with ORCID across Canada. And as it turns out, the U of A is by far the most used of these systems. You have the most individuals who have connected ORCID IDs to the system, and you have the most individuals who have received metadata updates. Those numbers are different because, of course, not everyone who connects an ORCID ID is going to have their article published. Not every article is published yet. So you're going to see some discrepancies there. The second column is always lower than the first column. And yeah, that's it. I am a little over time now. Apologies. But yeah, happy to chat.